Thank you for joining us for what will be the last lesson on the text of the book of Habakkuk. That may give a hint for where we're going, and I'll let you know about that at the end of the video. But thank you for joining our channel. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Those things truly do help us. And if you take a moment to spread the word about what we're doing here on the Fallen Family of Four, we would greatly appreciate it. We have a lot of things we have been doing, continue to do, and we hope that you're enjoying these Bible studies as well as the videos that Leah and Mary Carol have done. Still waiting on Turner, and hope that you also are enjoying our kids' Bible songs. Those have been received very well. We appreciate your interest in all that we're trying to do. Our goal on this is not to gain any notoriety for ourselves, but simply to spread the word of God and family values and different things along those lines, and hope that you are encouraged by everything that we're trying to do through our channel. So if you haven't watched the previous videos on Habakkuk, this is the last video of going through the text. We have walked somewhat slowly, although, as is the case with pretty much any book of the Bible, we could take hundreds of videos. We could take just line by line if we wanted to, but we're trying just to cover a few verses in each video, and this one will cover the last few verses of Habakkuk chapter 3. As I say each time, I've got my Bible right here, my notes in front of me, so I look down a lot because I don't try to memorize everything for these videos, but hopefully we're still able to be encouraged. I want to do a little introductory thought here, and then we'll read the text. If you're able to read along, we'll be in Habakkuk 3, beginning of verse 16. Excuse me, in just a moment. Let me begin by just saying this. Now, I've faced some struggles in my life. Anyone watching this, I'm sure has, but there are a lot of people who just absolutely over the years have amazed me with an inner strength, with a confidence in the Lord, despite circumstances that were very, very tragic in their lives, and in some cases continue to be difficult. I think of a friend that Leah and I have who, while she was in her mid-20s, was told by her husband that he never really loved her, and he wanted out of the marriage. Well, despite her faithfulness, despite pleading, despite her devotion, he, to use the clinical term, he served her papers, and that was that. But this then young adult lady, now very much a grown lady, continues to be just a beacon of faithfulness to the Lord. She serves behind the scenes in very quiet ways. She remains constant in her faith, and we're amazed by that. I think of friends that Leah and I continue to have who, I still remember the day that my cell phone rang, and I was told that their little boy, at the time, the age of about 5, they were told he had cancer in his brain, and they called me. And to this day, if I was given a few minutes, I could tell you exactly where I was, exactly where I parked to make that phone call on my cell phone, or receive that phone call, I should say, on my cell phone. That continues to be something that they deal with. What is now 12 years later or so, somewhere in that range, and they continue to be people of faith. Those people amaze me. I think of a friend of mine named Libby. I got to my office at a church building one day, not here at Central. This is before this time, and only to receive word that just a few moments earlier, her husband of many, many years, if I remember correctly, about 58 or 59 years, had died. But just a few, I believe just 2 days earlier, I had visited him in the hospital, and things seemed to be going very well. He was optimistic about not just getting out, but resuming quite a few things, and then he died. But when I got to her house to talk just a few moments later, she was struggling, of course, as you would only expect, but she was strong. And just a couple of days after that, I was preaching his funeral, and at her request, to use her words, took her to the Psalms. She asked me to preach from that book because those poems would help her soul. And she remained a faithful Bible class teacher until her passing sometime later. And the examples could go on and on. Those are just 3 that come to mind from a few years ago, because these people have continued, or did continue, to remain people of faith. And you may be thinking, as you're listening to those, about people you know who faced tremendous adversity in their life. And even though they questioned things, and that's part of it, they remained faithful to God. And as I said, these people amaze me by the reminders of them in my mind from time to time. And they fill me with hope that should I face some life-altering adversity, I can still trust the God of heaven. Now, with that in mind, I want us to read Habakkuk 3, verses 16 through 19. And then we're going to recap where we've been just for a moment, and then walk through these verses together. Habakkuk 3, beginning of verse 16. I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bone. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines. The produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on the high places. And you have this notation at the end of the book, to the choir master with stringed instruments. Habakkuk has not gone through this book without any questions. In fact, this book is based upon a lot of ways. His questioning of God, or as we called it, his complaints against God, a couple of them, very, very bold and very strong. It started, as you recall, with the prophet basically saying, how long are you going to let your own people go on in their wickedness, the people of Judah? Habakkuk was not claiming moral perfection, but he knew that the people of his day were wicked, and he knew that God would not stand for sin, even national sin, forever. But the Lord opened Habakkuk's eyes by showing the prophet that the Chaldeans, the Neo-Babylonians, they were going to be his instrument of punishment. And of course, that brought up a whole new set of issues in the mind of the prophet, because the Chaldeans, by perspective, were more wicked than the people of Judah were. And so Habakkuk then asked God, questioned God, complained to God, how God could use that wicked, awful nation as a means of his perfect justice. And the Lord, in a powerful display of his sovereignty and wisdom, showed that he clearly knew the sins of the Chaldeans also, and he also knew their future. They were going to get their punishment in time also. So God was not condoning their sin, but all nations, no matter how wicked, can be used for the justice of God in the movements of time. But all nations who do not remain faithful to the Lord will meet their demise in his time. And so knowing that, the prophet then responds with a prayer that's meant to be sung in what we know as chapter 2. It's a prayer that remembers the goodness and the severity of God, as Paul would write about in Romans chapter 11. It calls upon God to remember his mercy even as he's pouring out his wrath. We spent some time on that when we say Habakkuk 3 verse 2. The Lord had done so time and time again, and now the prophet seeks the same thing. And so with all of that as the background then, as Habakkuk contemplates the wrath of God and the justice of God or mercy of God, he writes that it makes him afraid. Did you notice that first verse that we read, verse 16? I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Again, that's verse 16 of chapter 3. The wrath of God was not something to be thought of only on an intellectual level. It was also not something that brought a lack of response from the prophet. When Habakkuk truly considered the wrath of God, it caused him to be afraid, even though it was tempered with the mercy of God. Whether we're considering the wrath of God on a pagan nation, a wicked nation, or whether we're considering the wrath of God on unrepentant sinners on the day of judgment, is that our reaction? Do we tremble at the thought of God's wrath being shown and poured out? Even if we are faithful to God, there will be some, in fact, there'll be many, who face the wrath of God on the day of judgment. And when we pause to consider their fate, it should overwhelm us. And further, it should motivate us to do what Jude would tell us to do in the New Testament, to snatch them out of the fire, Jude verse 23. There is no one that we should dislike, and certainly not hate so much, that the thought of their eternal punishment does not cause us to dread. Instead, it should be one of the greatest motivators we have of evangelistic measures and trying to reach people with the gospel. Habakkuk knew that punishment in a physical way was coming upon his people, but now he's also been shown the wrath of God was coming on the Chaldeans. And as troubled as he was by the prospect of seeing the wrath of God, he said, Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. You see, now he's in a place, even though he's fearful of some things, he's in a place of trust. He's not going to complain against the Lord any longer. He still doesn't understand everything. He can't. No one really could. But the prophet knows that the word of the Lord are true and that this will happen as God has ordained it to happen. And also, there's nothing the prophet can do to alter the course of God. And so he will quietly wait, even though he knows he is waiting for a day when trouble will come. Homer Haley wrote, quote, From perplexity and doubt, Habakkuk has passed through the school of God's revelation to him, and now he can look to whatever may come and meet it with quiet dignity and confidence, end quote. And so with that confidence then, Habakkuk ends this book with words that are just powerful, They're a beautiful statement of trust. It's a statement really of proper perspective, because it shows that Habakkuk's eyes have been raised not just to see God's sovereign nature over all the nations, although they have, but over everything. David Light describes these words as, quote, one of the greatest declarations of faith to be found in the Bible, end quote. And he's right. Even if the Chaldean army raided everything, and even if God's wrath caused economic ruin, Habakkuk was not going to leave the Lord. That's why he writes this beautiful poem. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. In a summary of those words, David Roper wrote in his commentary, quote, Habakkuk expressed a pledge of commitment. He had heard that hard times were coming upon Judah. The nation would be invaded and destroyed by the Chaldeans. The knowledge of impending doom might have driven others away from God. However, Habakkuk declared that nothing would cause him to turn away from the Lord. He said that whatever happened, however bad things might become, he would continue to praise the Lord, end quote. The prophet came to a realization and was willing to express it. And the realization was, as John MacArthur writes, that, quote, God was not to be worshipped merely because of the temporal blessings he bestowed, but for his own sake, end quote. And the reasons are many why that's true. The main reason is simply because he's God. And often that's what we forget. He deserves our trust, not just because of what he gives us or can give us, but because of who he is, because of his perfectly divine nature. And so the prophet then states that even in these difficult times, he's going to take joy. Why can he say that? Because God brings salvation. If we're trusting deeply in the Lord, nothing should be able to take our joy. And that's not to say we'll always be happy, that we'll always walk around with a smile on our face, but no external circumstances should ever rob us of our joy. It is rooted in the perfect nature of God, the Almighty, the only one who can and who does bring salvation. When tragedy strikes, it can be as if our whole life grinds to a halt. You hear people talk about it that way. It's as if time stopped or everything ground to a halt. We picture someone who's trying to put their life back together in grief as putting one foot in front of the other. We understand that terminology. It can seem as if that's all they can do, that they can scarcely walk. And even being able to do that is an accomplishment. Habakkuk looked at his situation in a slightly different light, at least now that he's reassured. When he writes in verse 19, God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. You see, the Lord was able to do more than just cause the prophet to put one foot in front of the other. Instead, even in a time when everything looked as if it was against the people, Habakkuk knew the sense of victory. And one more time, I'll quote from Homer Haley, quote, as the deer is able to climb to the summit of the mountain peak, far above the fears and shadows of the valley below, so Jehovah will make his faithful walk upon the high places, far above the doubts and despairs of the valley of shadows from which he has escaped. End quote. God can make people walk where they never could walk, even in times of grief, fear, overwhelming conditions. It may be in the moment that it is a victory for us to just put one foot in front of the other. But with the Lord, we have a greater victory promised to us if we'll just remain faithful to him. Now, that's not to say that everything is going to go perfectly every single day. It's not a health and wealth gospel. That's not it. Like Habakkuk, there may be seasons of our life when we cry out to God, how long? As he did in chapter 1 and verse 2. There may be times when, like the prophet, we raise a complaint to the Lord out of complete frustration and total confusion. And there may be times when, like the prophet, it's as if we wonder if God will answer. And we just kind of take our stand to see if he'll answer. Chapter 2, verse 1. But the book of Habakkuk reminds us that God has already answered. He has been faithful. He has shown his wrath, yes, but also his mercy. It shows us that he is in full control of all the nations, and that he will ultimately do what is right because he ultimately does what is right on his time. And though we may tremble when we consider the wrath of God, and rightly so, we know that God is forever faithful. And so, like the prophet Habakkuk, may we have quiet confidence in the Lord, no matter what might come. And even if everything around us seems to fall apart, may we be willing to say and to live that we will rejoice in the Lord and take joy in the God of our salvation. Chapter 3 and verse 18. I hope this walk through the book of Habakkuk is encouraging. I love this book. I'm not great with poetry, and so it's a challenging book for me, but I love this book because while it was written a long time ago about a very ancient situation, the themes of it are just as new as if you were waking up and reading the news this morning or the events of your own life even today. And so I hope walking through this book has encouraged you. As I kind of hinted at the beginning, even though we've walked the text, we're not quite done. We're going to have one last video on Habakkuk. That's a form of a sermon that I preached one time about that famous statement of Habakkuk about the just shall live by faith. And hopefully it encourages us to see the whole book as a whole, but also see how it fits in with that thought being restated in the New Testament for God's people today. The just or the righteous shall live by faith. So I hope you'll join us for that in a few days, and we hope you'll subscribe, like, all the right stuff, our channel here on YouTube, and we hope everything we do here is encouraging you to seek God and to seek to be faithful to Him and to enjoy home life and to just be encouraged by the good things He gives to us in our lives. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.